If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I will share a surprise story that I have prepared especially for you. Your support is really valuable for the continuation of these stories. The wind hadn't let up all night. It howled through the cottonwoods like a living thing, cold enough to snap your bones if you weren't prepared for it. The moon hung pale and sharp over the snow-covered fields of northern Wyoming, January 1881. The land stretched out flat and silent for miles, interrupted only by Jack Harlan's weather-beaten cabin and the lean-to barn standing a dozen yards away. Everything else was wind, snow, and the kind of quiet that made a man question why he stayed out here. Jack stood on the porch with his coat collar turned up and his rifle resting against the wall behind him. He held a lantern in one hand, the other tucked into a glove stiff with old leather. The cold worked its way into everything, his joints, his breath, the boards under his boots. He'd heard something, not an animal, not the wind, a sound that didn't belong, brief, soft, like fabric dragging across wood. He stepped off the porch without hurry, but with purpose. His boots crunched through packed snow. He'd done this walk 1,000 times, but tonight felt different. Something was off. His instincts, sharpened by years of living alone and surviving things that could kill a man twice over, told him to move quietly. Slowly. Jack Harlan was 51 years old, a Union cavalryman before the war ended, a ranch hand after that, and then a husband and father for a few short years before a fever took both in the winter of '76. Since then, he kept to himself. The nearest town, Shady Creek, was over an hour's ride by horse, and he went there as little as possible. He wasn't hiding, but he wasn't looking for anything either. His days were simple. Chop wood, tend the stock, cook what he needed, and let the rest be. That's why he wasn't prepared for what he found by the barn wall. At first, the shape looked like a sack of old cloth, half buried in a drift. But when his lantern hit it, he saw the unmistakable outline of a person, slumped, motionless, curled into themselves. His pulse jumped. He moved faster now, snow flying under his boots. He dropped to one knee. A woman, mid-20s maybe. Her face was red with windburn, her lips cracked and bluish. Her dark hair was stuck to her cheek with ice. And in her arms, wrapped in what looked like a torn wool blanket, was a baby, tiny, unmoving, its skin a dull color he didn't like at all. Jack didn't ask questions. He didn't waste time thinking about whether this made sense or what trouble it might bring. He leaned down, tested the baby's chest with the back of his gloved fingers. There was still breath, shallow and uneven, but it was there. The woman stirred slightly, her head tipping toward him. Her eyes cracked open for barely a second before they rolled back again. She was almost gone. The fact that they were alive at all, this far from shelter in this kind of cold, was a miracle. He looked around the empty yard, the road beyond it buried in wind and snow. There was no wagon, no horse, no tracks he could see, just her, just the baby. He didn't have time to wonder how or why. Jack adjusted his grip, hooked his arm under her shoulders, and lifted her up with the kind of effort that made his back grind. She didn't weigh much. She hadn't eaten in days, he guessed. Her boots were soaked through, and one of them had a broken sole. Her coat was barely more than a threadbare shawl, full of holes and stiff from a cold. He carried them to the cabin in silence. Inside, the warmth hit them like a wall. The fire was still burning in the stone hearth. He laid the woman on the bed in the corner and peeled the frozen blanket from a baby. The child made a faint, rattling whimper, weak but alive. Jack unwrapped it, grabbed one of his clean shirts from the trunk, and wrapped it around the baby's small body. He didn't speak as he worked. He poured water into a tin basin and laid a cloth on the woman's forehead. Then he added wood to the fire until the room was almost uncomfortably hot. She needed warmth. The baby needed to sweat. If it didn't come around soon, he'd have to ride for Doc Finley in Shady Creek. But that was still hours away, and the snow wasn't showing signs of stopping. He glanced down at the woman, her cheekbones sharp, lips trembling even in the heat. She had scratches on her hands, red marks on her wrist, and a bruise starting to bloom under one eye. Whoever she was, whatever she'd been through, she hadn't just wandered here by accident. He pulled off his coat, hung it on the peg, and sat in the chair by the bed. The baby stirred again. Jack leaned forward, watching its chest rise and fall. He could hear it in the back of his mind, his wife's voice, years ago, whispering to their son in the early mornings before the fever came. It came to him without warning. He clenched his jaw and looked away. He had buried that memory with the others. He didn't want it back. But here it was. Eventually, the baby dozed off again. The woman didn't wake. Jack sat back in the chair, arms folded, staring at the floorboards as if they could tell him what came next. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know where she came from. And he sure as hell didn't know why she ended up on his property, nearly frozen to death in the dead of night. But one thing was clear. She wasn't going anywhere tonight. Neither was he. Morning didn't come all at once. It crept in through the frost-covered windows, casting a dull gray light across the floor of the cabin. Jack Harlan was already awake. He hadn't slept much. He'd sat in that chair by the bed most of the night, getting up only to add more wood to the fire or check if the baby was still breathing. The baby, he was small, couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 months old. He made little noises now in his sleep, soft gurgles that sounded like he was trying to cry but didn't have the strength for it. Jack had laid him in a crate near the fire and stuffed it with wool and shirts to keep him warm. He wasn't sure if it would be enough, but it was all he had. The woman hadn't stirred in hours. Jack stood now, stretching his arms and walking stiffly to the stove. He filled the kettle, set it on the flames, and stared at the bed. She looked a little better. Some color had come back to her face. Her breathing had steadied. But the bruises were clearer now, one on her jaw, another under her eye, and a long red welt along the side of her neck. She hadn't gotten those from the cold. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask questions, not yet. He had a rule about that. If people wanted to talk, they would. If they didn't, pushing wouldn't help. Still, his mind kept circling the same thoughts. Who was she? Why was she alone out there? No horse, no wagon, no man, just a baby wrapped in a blanket out in the dead of night. People didn't survive those odds by accident. He poured the boiling water into a tin mug and stirred in what passed for coffee grounds. It was bitter, but it warmed his chest. He stepped over to the bed and crouched beside her, touching her forehead lightly. Still warm, not feverish. Her eyes twitched under closed lids. A few minutes later, she stirred. It wasn't much, just a faint movement of her lips and a shallow breath. But Jack saw it. He leaned in. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened, sluggish and unfocused. She blinked at the ceiling, then turned her head slightly. Her gaze landed on Jack, where her voice cracked, dry, barely audible. "You're safe," he said. "In my cabin. Found you by the barn." She blinked again. Her expression changed, something between confusion and fear, and her hand shot out toward the crate. Jack caught the motion and stepped aside so she could see. The baby was still sleeping, snug and quiet. "He's fine," Jack added, breathing steady. "Slept most of the night." The woman exhaled a rough, uneven breath. She closed her eyes for a second longer, then opened them again. "You're not going to send us away?" Jack shook his head. "Not in this weather." She tried to sit up. He reached forward automatically to help, but she winced when she moved her left side. Jack noticed how she pulled her shirt closed with one arm, almost instinctively shielding herself. He stepped back, gave her room. "You got a name?" he asked quietly. She hesitated. "Then Mara. Mara Collins." Jack nodded. The name didn't mean anything to him, but he filed it away. "You, Jack Harlan." She looked around the cabin. It was plain but clean. Sparse furniture. A rifle leaning by the door. Tools on the wall. A single framed photo, faded above the hearth. "You live alone?" she asked, voice still hoarse. "I do." There was a pause. She looked down at her hands, rubbed her fingers together as if still not convinced she was safe. "I didn't think we'd make it," she whispered. I didn't know where else to go." Jack didn't respond right away. He didn't ask where she came from, or why she ran, or what had happened to her face. Those answers would come, or they wouldn't. He wasn't the kind of man who demanded explanations from someone who barely had breath to speak. Instead, he poured her a second mug of water and handed it to her. She took it with shaking fingers. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and went back to tending the fire. Later that day, while she rested and the baby finally woke and cried, Jack went out to the barn. He checked again, looked for tracks, broken branches, anything. The snow had covered most of it, but he found one thing behind the barn, near the fence line, a torn strip of leather. The kind you find on a saddle, or maybe a boot strap. Too new to have been there long. He brought it back inside and placed it in a drawer without a word. That evening, Mara fed the baby while sitting propped against the headboard. Her eyes followed Jack's movements as he cut meat for stew and prepared the evening meal. She didn't say much. Neither did he, but the silence wasn't hostile. It was watchful, careful. When she finished feeding the baby, she laid him in the crate again and sat there for a long time, staring at the flames. "Why'd you help us?" she asked quietly. Jack didn't look at her. He stirred the stew and said, "Wasn't a decision." That answer sat between them for a while. He didn't tell her about the graves on the hill, about his wife and son, about how 5 winters ago he'd found himself too late to stop the sickness, too late to change anything. He'd buried them and locked something away so deep inside that he hadn't touched it since. But when he found her by that barn, half frozen, broken, still holding on to her child, he hadn't hesitated. It wasn't pity. It wasn't charity. It was something else. She didn't ask more that night, and he didn't offer. But when he passed her the bowl of stew and she said, "Thank you" again, this time quieter, almost like she didn't want him to hear it, Jack gave the smallest nod. Something had changed. He didn't know what it was yet, but he felt it, and so did she. The snow began to ease by the fourth morning, not enough to melt, but enough that the wind no longer screamed through the cracks in the walls. The light was softer, and for the first time since the storm began, Jack stepped outside without squinting against a white wall of sky. He shoveled a path from the cabin to the barn, checked the livestock, and chopped wood until his arms burned with the familiar ache of effort. He preferred that work that didn't ask questions, didn't demand answers. Inside, the cabin was warmer now. The fire burned constantly. Mara had been on her feet for short periods, careful not to overdo it. Her body was still healing, but she moved with a determination Jack recognized. She was trying to earn her keep. That morning, while Jack hauled firewood, she swept the floor with one of his old brooms and washed out the basin without asking. The baby, Tommy, she'd finally said, was doing better. Still quiet, but no longer too quiet. His skin looked healthier. His little hands moved more. Jack had noticed. He hadn't said anything about it, but he noticed. That day, while Jack was setting traps along the frozen creek bed behind the barn, Mara finally looked through his few belongings. Not snooping, just taking stock. Jack had left the rifle by the door, his coat on the wall hook. She didn't touch them, but her eyes lingered on the photograph above the hearth. It was an old one, black and white, edges curling with age. A man in a uniform, a woman beside him, holding a baby. Jack, his wife, their son. When Jack came back in, Mara was sitting at the table, peeling potatoes with one of his pocket knives. He saw her glance at the photo, then back down. She was beautiful, Mara said, voice neutral. Jack placed the traps by the door and wiped his hands. Her name was Eliza. She your wife? He nodded. And the boy? He hesitated, then said Nathan. There was a long pause. Neither of them looked at the photo again. What happened to them? She asked. Not to pry, but because silence had stretched too far. Fever, Jack said flatly. 5 years back. Took 'em both in the same week. Mara's eyes dropped to her hands. She didn't press, but she understood now. Why he lived out here alone. Why there was only one chair at the table and one plate on the shelf. Why the man who had carried her in from the cold hadn't spoken more than 10 words the first night. Later that day, Jack caught her trying to lift a pail of water from the stove with her bad arm. He took it from her without saying anything, set it aside, and moved the pot for her. She gave a short nod of thanks, and they went on without speaking. The baby cried that evening, a real cry this time, sharp and urgent. Jack was skinning a rabbit at the table when he heard it. Mara was at the stove, and she turned fast, reaching Tommy in 2 steps. She picked him up and rocked him, whispering quietly. Jack watched from the corner of his eye. Her voice was low and steady, her hands practiced. That surprised him. She was young, too young, he thought, to have dealt with what she had. But she held the baby like someone who'd been doing it alone for a while. You got family? Jack asked suddenly. She looked up, caught off guard. Not anymore. Where do you come from? Dakota Territory, a place called Stillwater. Jack nodded slowly. That's a long way. I know. She shifted the baby in her arms. We left 2 weeks ago. Walked most of it. Caught a wagon for a few miles before they tossed us out. I think they figured I was trouble. Maybe I was. Jack didn't respond, but his expression sharpened. Why'd you leave? He asked. Mara looked down at Tommy. Her lips tightened. My husband died last fall. His brothers thought I owed them something. Thought the baby should be theirs, too. I didn't wait around to find out what that meant. She said it without emotion. Just facts. Like telling a story that didn't belong to her anymore. But Jack could see it. In the way she stood. The way she always kept her back to a wall, never fully relaxed. The way she watched the door, even when she pretended not to. You ever shoot a gun? He asked. Mara blinked, then nodded. Once. My pa taught me before I got married. I never used it after. There's a pistol in the drawer under the stove. Just in case. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded again. That night, after supper, Jack noticed her limping a little. He didn't say anything, but he filled the wash basin again and set out one of his last clean towels. She saw it and gave him a tired, appreciative glance. No words. As the wind picked up again outside and the temperature began to drop, Jack stood by the window and looked out across the field. Nothing moved, just darkness and snow. But his hand rested near the rifle. He didn't know who was out there, or what might come looking for Mara Collins and her child. But he knew this. If anyone did, they wouldn't take another step past his porch. Not while he was still breathing. The days started blending into each other. Snow still covered the ground, but the light had changed. It wasn't as sharp, not as cruel. The sun stayed out a little longer each afternoon. It melted the edges of the roof, and the wind carried the drip of water through the quiet. Jack took notice. He'd lived long enough to read weather like a calendar. Spring wasn't here yet, but it was coming. Inside the cabin, a different kind of thaw was happening. Mara moved more freely now, her limbs still there, but fading. She didn't ask for help anymore. She washed her own clothes, rocked the baby to sleep while humming under her breath, and, more than once, put a hand to Jack's shoulder when passing behind him in the small space they shared. That had never happened the first week. She had always kept distance. Now, without making a decision, that distance was smaller. Jack noticed. She had started cooking. Her hands were quick, practiced. She didn't waste anything. And when she found a stash of dry herbs Jack had mostly forgotten about, she used them, sprinkling sage into the beans, softening the rabbit stew. He didn't say much, but when she placed a plate in front of him and sat down without waiting for approval, something in him shifted again. They had never said they were staying. Neither had asked, but neither had brought up leaving, either. One evening, as Mara folded laundry near the fire and Jack sharpened his skinning knife by the window, she said something that caught him off guard. You said they died 5 winters ago. He glanced up. Yeah. Were you here, in this cabin, when it happened? I was. His voice was quiet but steady. Why didn't you leave after? Jack stared at the knife, then at the fire. I tried. Sold off some cattle. Packed up what I thought I needed. Got as far as Cheyenne. Didn't even get off the wagon. Just turned around and came back. Why? He thought about that. Couldn't figure out where else I'd be, he said after a moment. Didn't feel like I belonged anywhere anymore. At least here, I knew what the pain was. Out there, it felt like pretending. Mara didn't say anything for a while. She folded another shirt. I did the same thing, she said finally. After Nate died, my husband, I thought about going to Missouri. My cousin lives there. But every road felt wrong. I kept seeing him at the edge of everything, like he was waiting for me to turn back. Did you love him? Jack asked without looking up. There was a long pause. I did. At first. He changed after the baby came. Got cold. Started drinking. Said I made him weak. His brothers were worse. When he died in a logging accident, they told me the house and everything in it belonged to them now. Told me to pack what I could carry and go. I took Tommy and left that night. Jack absorbed that quietly. No yayment. No piti. Just facts being passed between two people who had stopped expecting easy answers. He stood up, walked to the shelf, and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside were cloth scraps, buttons, 2 needles, a bit of thread. Thought you might need this, he said, placing it on the table. Mara ran her fingers across the lid before opening it. She smiled just a little, but it was the first real one he'd seen. Thank you. That night, the wind picked up again. Not hard, but enough to rattle the windows slightly. Jack checked the doors, made sure the latch on the barn was holding. He walked around the edge of the property with a lantern, boots crunching through old snow, rifle in hand. Nothing. No tracks. No signs of movement. Still, he stayed outside longer than usual. Inside the cabin, Mara sat by the fire, the baby asleep in her arms. She looked down at the boy, then around the room. Her eyes lingered on the photograph, the neatly stacked woodpile, the clean dishes. She looked at the chair Jack always sat in, then back at the baby. She didn't know if they were staying forever. But for now, it felt like safety. And for the first time since Stillwater, she wasn't planning what to do if she had to run. When Jack came back in, he shook the snow from his coat, hung it on the wall, and glanced at her. All quiet, he replied. She nodded. Then, without thinking too hard about it, she said, if something happens, I can shoot. I won't let them take him. Jack's eyes locked with hers. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just said, they won't get past me. That was the closest either of them had come to saying what they both knew. The danger wasn't gone. It was out there, moving slowly, waiting for the right moment. But so were they, two people no longer broken, just scarred and no longer alone. That night, they both slept better. Not because the world was safe, but because someone else was keeping watch. By the time the next supply run came around, the snow had melted enough for wagon ruts to show through the muddy road east of the property. Jack had waited a full 3 weeks since his last trip into Shady Creek. Longer than usual. He'd been putting it off. Not out of fear, but something closer to hesitation. The cabin had changed. Or maybe he had. He didn't like the thought of leaving Mara and the baby alone, even for half a day. But supplies were low, flour, coffee, bullets. And Mara, though she said nothing, was down to her last nursing cloths. They needed things. There was no avoiding it. That morning, he saddled the horse and packed the list into his coat pocket. Mara stood by the door, holding Tommy, eyes steady, but there was a tightness around her mouth she didn't bother to hide. How long? She asked. Back by sundown, Jack said. If I'm not, bolt the doors and keep the pistol close. I always do, she replied. He adjusted the saddlebag and gave her a last glance. Don't answer the door for anyone. I won't. There was a moment where it looked like she might say more, but she didn't. He tipped his hat once and rode out. The trail to Shady Creek was rough with thawing mud and patches of slush, but Jack made good time. The town was just waking when he arrived. A few wagons lining the main street, smoke coming from chimneys, and the sharp sound of a hammer from the blacksmith shop. He tied his horse out front of the general store and walked in with the same measured steps he always used. The shopkeeper, Leonard Hatch, nodded in recognition. Well now, look who decided to come back from the dead, Leonard said. Thought we'd lost you to the mountains this winter. Jack handed over his list without returning the joke. Need these. Also another wool blanket if you've got one. Leonard raised an eyebrow. Stocking up. Jack met his eyes. You could say that. Leonard didn't push it. He knew better. While Leonard filled the order, Jack glanced out the front window and caught something that made his jaw tighten. A rider across the street, slouched in the saddle, watching the store. The man was thin, maybe late 20s, long coat, scruffy jaw. Jack didn't recognize him, but the way he stared said he wasn't just curious. He was looking for something, or someone like Mara. When Jack stepped out with the sack over his shoulder, the rider straightened up a little, looked him over, then turned his horse and rode slowly toward the saloon. Jack didn't follow. He'd seen that kind of move before, too casual to be natural. He made a note of the brand on the man's saddle. A crooked bee burned into the leather. Back at the cabin, Mara had kept the day quiet. She did the laundry early and brought in more firewood. She read aloud to Tommy from one of Jack's old books, just her voice filling the room, steady and calm. But she kept one ear turned toward the wind. Every hoofbeat made her stomach knot. Every creak of the roof made her grip tighten. By late afternoon, she had stoked the fire, locked the doors, and placed the loaded pistol on the table next to her. Tommy was asleep in the crate by the hearth. When she finally heard the sound of Jack's horse coming up the path, something inside her unclenched. Jack stepped in, his coat damp from the ride, face unreadable. "Everything all right?" she asked. He set the supplies down and walked to the window. "Someone was asking questions in town," he said after a pause. "Didn't say much. Just stared too long. Did he follow you?" Jack shook his head. "No, not today." She waited, watching him. Then she asked the question that had been burning since he left. "What they come here?" Jack didn't answer right away. He poured coffee from the kettle, drank half of it before turning around. "They'll come eventually. Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not next week. But they will." Mara sat down slowly, eyes on the fire. "I thought about leaving again," she said quietly. "Packing up and just going further west. But I'd have nowhere to go. No one to trust." "You trust me?" Jack asked. Mara looked up. Her eyes didn't flinch. "Do." Jack nodded once. "Then we prepare." That evening, after supper, Jack cleaned both rifles and laid out the ammunition. Mara watched him closely, asked how to load, how to check the chamber, how to fire steady even with cold hands. He showed her, patiently, wordlessly. As the baby slept, they moved around the cabin with more purpose. Reinforced the windows, added a second lock to the front door. Jack started clearing a space near the woodpile where they could dig a backup root cellar if needed. She didn't question the work. She helped. Later that night, as the wind picked up and the last of the light left the hills, Mara lit the oil lamp and sat beside him near the fire. "You think you're ready to fight again?" she asked softly. Jack stared into the flames. "I never stopped." She leaned back in her chair, pulled the blanket higher over her knees. "Neither did I," she said. And for the first time since she arrived, the room felt full, not just of warmth, but of something heavier, something stronger. A quiet resolve between two people who had already lost everything and had decided, without saying so, not to lose again. The sky turned overcast again the next morning, thick clouds dragging slowly over the hills like a warning. Jack stood on the porch with a mug of coffee in one hand, his rifle propped just inside the door. The trees beyond the pasture were still, but the silence didn't sit right. It was the kind of quiet that made animals stop grazing and men start watching their backs. He stepped down into the muddy yard and checked the barn first. The horses were calm, but restless. Their ears twitched toward the east. Jack noticed. He always did. He filled their trough, looked over the fencing, then walked the property line without saying a word to Mara. Inside the cabin, she was awake early. She hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined hoofbeats in the distance, boots in the snow. She'd taken to sleeping with the pistol within arm's reach, and even when Tommy stirred in the night, she woke with a start. But this morning, she moved through her chores like it was any other day. Boiling water, folding clothes, whispering lullabies to the baby while watching the window with one eye. She didn't ask Jack what he saw outside. She didn't need to. The tension in his shoulders told her enough. Around midday, Jack came in, set down his rifle, and pulled a folded cloth from his coat. He placed it on the table without comment. Mara opened it and saw a handful of cartridges, well-oiled and clean. "You reload these?" she asked. He nodded. "Keep them dry." She ran her thumb over the brass and exhaled quietly. "Do you think it's a brother's?" "Could be. Or someone they sent." Jack sat down across from her. "Could also be just a man who heard a story and wants something for himself. Out here, people think women on the run are free for the taking." She didn't flinch at the words. "I've seen it." They didn't speak for a while. Outside, the wind shifted. A low creak came from the barn door, but nothing else. That afternoon, Jack started moving supplies into a crawl space under the floorboards. Dried meat, powder, matches, blankets. Mara helped. She didn't ask why. She already knew. He showed her how to lift the boards without drawing attention, how to secure them again with a nail from the inside. It wasn't just precaution. It was preparation. As they worked, she asked something that had lingered since the day he rode to town. "Back in Stillwater, if they come here and they say I'm a thief or a liar, what'll you believe?" Jack didn't stop hammering. He didn't look up. "I don't care what they say," he answered. "You're here now. That's all that matters." Mara nodded slowly. Her shoulders eased slightly, but the tightness in her chest remained. Trust was a fragile thing, and she didn't expect it from anyone anymore. But Jack's words didn't feel like a promise. They felt like a fact, something solid she could stand on. That evening, as they ate by firelight, the unease in the air didn't leave. Tommy, now more alert, played with a wooden spoon Mara had carved for him. His giggles, while faint, broke the silence, and Jack caught himself smiling, just for a second, before his eyes drifted again toward the door. After dinner, Jack went out to check the livestock again. Mara stayed inside with Tommy, rocking him slowly, whispering old lullabies passed down from her mother. She barely noticed the sound at first, just a distant thud, soft, almost like thunder. Then another, closer. Her body tensed. She placed the baby in the crate, stood up, and walked to the window. Nothing yet, but the sound was steady now. Hooves. More than one horse. She turned toward the door, grabbed the pistol from a shelf, and moved back to the fire, staying low. Moments later, Jack stepped in. His coat was wet from sleet, his voice clipped. 3 riders. Coming up the north trail. Mara's jaw tightened. You recognize them? No. She looked down at Tommy. We should hide. Not yet. Jack picked up his rifle, checked the chamber, then nodded toward the rear window. Take the baby. Go behind the stove. Stay low. If I tell you to run, you don't stop. Mara obeyed. Her movements were quick but careful. She scooped Tommy up, wrapped him in the blanket, and moved to the back wall. Jack stepped out onto the porch, the wind slicing cold across his face. The riders came into view slowly. 3 men. Dusty coats. One with a thick mustache and a scar down his cheek. Another wore a bowler hat too small for his head. The third had a rifle across his lap and a crooked grin. Jack didn't raise his weapon. Not yet. The man in front spoke first. His voice was slick, false friendly. Evening. Name's Clay Barrick. We're looking for a woman. Young. Brown hair. Traveling with a baby boy. Said to be headed west. You seen anyone like that? Jack didn't move. No. You sure? Word is she's trouble. Ran off with property that ain't hers. Got some kin who want her back. Jack's voice stayed even. Ain't nobody like that around here. Clay leaned forward slightly in his saddle, squinting toward the cabin. Mind if we take a look? I mind. The man with the rifle adjusted in his seat. Jack shifted his weight, grip tightening on the stock. You lawmen? Jack asked. They didn't answer. Didn't think so. The tension thickened. Cold wind moved between them. Horses snorted, hooves scraped dirt. Then Jack said one word, low and final. Go. Clay stared a moment longer. Then, without a word, tugged his reins. The 3 turned and rode back down the trail, slow but deliberate. Jack watched until they disappeared past the trees. He waited. 10 minutes. Then 20. Then finally walked back inside, closing the door behind him. They'll come back, he said. Mara looked up from where she sat, still holding Tommy. Her hands were shaking, but her face was set. Then we'll be ready, she said. And this time, Jack didn't nod. He just sat down across from her, loaded the rifle again, and began planning for war. The days that followed passed like coiled wire, tense, quiet, and waiting to snap. The 3 riders hadn't returned, but Jack knew better than to believe they were gone. Men like that didn't ride out into the cold on a hunch and walk away empty-handed. They were scouts, feeling the edges, testing how much resistance they'd face when they came back with more. Jack doubled the firewood stack, checked the fencing every morning, and reinforced the latch on the barn. Every task took twice the time now, not because of the weather, but because he was listening, watching, expecting. Inside the cabin, Mara stayed close. She moved with quiet efficiency, but Jack could see the weight on her. She didn't sleep much anymore. The pistol never left the table. She jumped at noises now. Branch taps, wind shifts, even the kettle whistling too sharp. Her fear wasn't panic. It was muscle deep, built from experience. She wasn't waiting for the worst to happen. She was preparing to meet it. One morning, while Jack was checking the traps by the creek bed, Mara opened a drawer she hadn't looked in before. Inside were notebooks. A few pages yellowed with age, the writing rough and blocky. One was dated January 5th, 1876. That name again, Eliza. Then Nathan. She didn't read past the first paragraph. It felt too private, but it answered a question she hadn't dared ask. Jack had once written things down not for himself, but for someone else to remember. When he came back, she placed the book where it was and said nothing. But something about the way she handed him his coffee told him she'd seen it. He didn't get angry. He didn't speak, but his eyes softened. Later that day, Jack led her out back, just beyond the edge of the barn, where the brush thickened around a low ridge. He moved aside a few stones and pointed down. A narrow trench, half covered with a slanted board and old tarp. "Emergency line," he said. "If they come from the front, you take Tommy and go this way. Follow the fence to the dry creek bed. You'll find a hollow tree with a mark carved on the side. Hide there until I come." Mara knelt and examined it. "You dug this yourself?" "After Eliza died. I thought I was done using it." Mara stood and brushed her hands on her skirt. "You're not done." "Not yet." That night, they both sat at the table longer than usual. The baby slept in his crate, soft breaths rising and falling under the worn blanket. The wind outside had turned to a slow whistle, brushing across the chimney in long, uneasy waves. Mara looked at Jack. Her voice was low. "What if they don't ask next time? What if they come shooting?" Jack didn't hesitate. "Then I shoot back." She nodded. "And if they take me anyway?" "They won't." "You don't know that." "Edo." She studied him for a long moment. Her eyes didn't hold fear this time, just truth. "If something happens to me, take care of him." "I will," he said. "And if something happens to you, I won't run." Jack looked across the table at her. This woman who had arrived in the dead of night, frozen and silent, and now sat here making war plans with him like they'd been fighting side by side for years. "You shouldn't have to fight," he said. "But I will." And that was it. Nothing more needed to be said. The next day, they kept the baby indoors, the rifle near the door. Jack didn't go to town. Mara didn't step outside the fence. The whole property held its breath. And then, on the third morning, just before sunrise, Jack spotted the glint of metal on the ridge. Far enough to be watching. Close enough to be a threat. He didn't raise the rifle. He didn't shout. He simply turned, walked inside, and began lighting every lamp in the house. "They're out there," he said. Mara didn't panic. She grabbed the pistol, checked the rounds, and nodded. "How many?" "Hard to tell. At least 2. Maybe more." She stood, adjusted Tommy's blanket, and reached for her coat. "Then we get ready." That night, they didn't sleep. They stayed near the windows, shadows flickering across the walls, the baby cradled between them. The fire burned low, not for heat, but to keep the light soft. Quiet. Controlled. They didn't speak of what tomorrow might bring. There was no point. They had already decided. They wouldn't be leaving, and they wouldn't be giving up. The air was still before dawn, thick with the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, it feels loaded. Jack didn't sleep at all. Neither did Mara. The baby had drifted in and out of shallow naps, quiet and unaware of the tension stretching through the small cabin. The rifle rested against Jack's leg. The pistol was within Mara's reach on the table. Neither spoke as the sky behind the hills shifted from black to steel gray. By the time the first ray of sun slipped over the ridge, Jack was already outside, crouched behind a stack of split wood near the barn. He scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. Not at first. Then he saw it. A shadow broke from the trees. A rider. Then a second. Then a third. All silent. All deliberate. They weren't trying to sneak. They wanted to be seen. Jack narrowed his eyes. Same men from before. Clay Barrick in front, with the crooked smile and the thin, leathery face. He wasn't smiling now. Behind him, 2 more shapes emerged. Men Jack hadn't seen before. One held a rifle across his lap. The other carried rope. That told him everything. They were here to take someone. Jack didn't move. He waited until the riders reached the far fence line. Then he stood up, slowly, clearly. Clay stopped his horse. "Morning again," he called. "Didn't think we'd need to come back, but here we are." Jack's voice was flat. "You're trespassing." Clay chuckled. "We're just visiting, looking to collect what don't belong to you." Jack didn't blink. "She's not yours to collect. She's got debts. Family business. Ain't your concern." Jack raised the rifle halfway. "It is now." For a second, nobody moved. Even the horses were still. Inside the cabin, Mara stood with her back against the door. She could hear every word. Tommy was wrapped in the sling across her chest, sound asleep. She held the pistol tight, but steady, breath controlled. She was waiting for a sound, a shot, anything that would tell her when it started. Outside, Clay slowly dismounted. He didn't draw his gun, but his right hand hovered close. "You sure you want to die over a woman you barely know?" he asked. Jack's grip didn't change. "Better men have." Clay tilted his head. "Ain't your son, either." "He's not yours," Jack said. Clay took one more step. Jack fired. The shot cracked through the still morning like a whip. Clay dropped behind his horse as the bullet slammed into the saddle horn, splintering leather and wood. The others scattered fast, diving for cover behind a tree and a wagon they'd stashed down the road. From inside the cabin, Mara heard it and moved. She bolted the back door, crossed to the front, and crouched by the window. Through the slit in the shutters, she could see Jack take position behind the fence post, already loading another round. She didn't hesitate. She wrapped the sling tighter around Tommy, then moved to the crawlspace Jack had shown her 2 chapters ago, this time not just as a drill. Another shot rang out. Jack ducked, returned fire. The man with the rope caught one in the shoulder and spun off his horse, screaming as he hit the dirt. The other 2 returned fire now, the crack of their rifles echoing across the hills. But Jack was steady. He knew every corner of his land. He moved between the barn and the wagon, drawing them in, controlling the angles. The fight didn't last long. When the smoke cleared, 2 were on the ground. Clay was gone, escaped back into the trees on foot, bleeding from the arm. Jack stood in the stillness, eyes scanning the woods, chest heaving with controlled breath. He didn't chase. He never needed to. A man like Clay wouldn't come back after today. Not when he'd seen what Jack was willing to do. Not when he'd learned this wasn't a cabin with a widow and a baby. It was a fortress guarded by someone with nothing left to lose. Jack lowered the rifle and walked back toward the house. Mara was already on the porch, Tommy in her arms. Her face was pale but calm. Her hands weren't shaking. "It's done?" she asked. Jack nodded once. "For now." She looked toward the tree line. "He'll come back." Jack didn't argue. "Maybe, but not today." They stood there for a while in the gray light, both of them silent, both of them knowing that a line had been crossed. The outside world had come for them and left broken. That night, after they'd buried the dead away from the fence and burned the wagon for firewood, they sat together on the porch. No lights, just stars. Jack held a coffee mug in both hands. Mara sat close beside him, the baby asleep between them in a wrapped bundle of wool. "You ever think about leaving here?" she asked. "Used to. Still do." He looked out at the trees, at the fence, at the barn, then at her. "No," he said, "not anymore." She didn't answer, but her head leaned slightly against his shoulder. The quiet between them was different now. Not watchful, not guarded, just full. And for the first time, Jack realized something he hadn't dared admit. He didn't want to be alone anymore. And he wasn't. The next morning brought sun. Not warm, not gentle, but clear. It filtered through the clouds and hit the roof of the cabin, casting long shadows across the mud-packed yard. Jack stood on the porch with a hammer in one hand and a coil of fencing wire slung over his shoulder. The attack had taken its toll. Splintered rails, a shattered post, blood dried in the dirt. He didn't speak about it. He just worked. Mara watched him from the window. She held Tommy against her hip, slowly rocking him while sipping the last of the morning's coffee. Her body still carried tension. Her eyes moved quickly, checking corners, listening for what wasn't there. But beneath that alertness, something else had begun to settle. Not peace exactly, but acceptance. They'd been tested, and they hadn't run. She stepped outside and joined Jack as he hammered the final nail into the fence post. He gave her a glance, then returned to work. "We should plant early," she said. He nodded. "Soon as the ground softens. I'll help." Jack stopped hammering for a moment, leaning slightly on the post. "You planning on staying that long?" Mara's expression didn't shift. "I never planned on leaving." They didn't speak again for several minutes. But the silence between them no longer felt like avoidance. It felt like understanding. Later, while Tommy napped in the warmth near the stove, Jack and Mara shared a rare midday meal together. Beans, flatbread, and cured venison. Simple food, but it tasted better now. Maybe because they'd earned it. As she cleared the table, Mara looked up. You never asked about the money. Jack raised his eyes slightly. What money? The brothers. They said I stole from them. That's why they came. Jack said nothing. Mara dried her hands on the towel and leaned on the counter. They left me nothing. After Nate died, they cleaned out the barn, sold the cattle, took his horse. But I found some coin he'd hidden in a tin box under the floorboards. I didn't know it was there. Not until after they were already pushing me out. I took it, used it to buy passage west. She looked down at the table. If I'd left it, Tommy and I would have died before Wyoming. Jack's voice was low. Then it wasn't stealing. They'd say different. They already did, he replied. Didn't change anything. Mara looked up, met his eyes. You're not going to ask for it? He shook his head. You already paid enough. That night, a knock came at the door. Jack was standing near the fire, oiling the rifle. Mara froze by the crib. He raised a hand to her. Stay back. He stepped quietly to the window, peering through the slit in the curtain. One man, alone, older, broad-shouldered, coat dusted in trail snow, no rifle in hand. Jack opened the door just enough to see clearly. Name's Rourke, the man said. Deputy Marshal out of Cheyenne. I'm looking for a woman named Mara Collins. Jack didn't move. Why, he asked. She's listed in a missing persons report out of Stillwater. Filed under suspicious circumstances. Been trying to track her for 2 months. Her husband's family claimed she took something that wasn't hers. But from what I've heard, they left out a lot. Jack stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind him. What do you want with her? Want to hear her side. That's all. Swear to it. By the badge. Jack stared at him for a long moment, then called over his shoulder. Mara. She came to the doorway. Eyes narrowed, pistol tucked at her side. Rourke took off his hat. Mom, I'm not here to take you anywhere. But I need to ask, do you want to press charges against the Barrick family? Mara didn't speak right away. Then, would it matter? Men like them. Once they cross state lines, we can do something. But only if someone speaks. Otherwise, they keep doing it to the next woman. Mara looked at Jack, then at the baby, then back at the lawman. No, she said. I don't want to see them again. I don't want their names in my mouth. I just want to live. Rourke nodded. Fair enough. Then I'll mark you as found. Case closed. He handed her a small paper. You ever wanted different? This tells the judge you came in honest. Jack walked him back to his horse. Rourke turned before mounting. You're not just some rancher, are you? Jack shrugged. Used to be more. Don't talk about it. Rourke smiled faintly. Well, you keep her safe. Looks like you already have. With that, he rode off into the trees. Jack returned to the house. Mara stood just inside, staring down at the paper. Does this mean it's over? She asked. Jack stepped up beside her. No, he said quietly. But it means they don't get to write the end. She looked up at him, a flicker of something stronger than relief in her eyes. Then I'll write it myself. And for the first time since that freezing night by the barn, she smiled. Not just with her lips, but with her eyes. She was home, and she knew it. Spring came late that year, but it came. The last patches of snow melted into the earth, giving way to soft mud, new grass, and the smell of thawed pine carried on the wind. The creek behind the ridge, silent for most of winter, began to murmur again. Birds returned to the trees, and the land around the cabin shifted from gray to green in a matter of weeks. Jack was up early most days, tending to the soil, planting rows of beans, corn, and potatoes. Mara helped when Tommy slept, kneeling in the dirt beside him, hands steady, focused. She'd never farmed before, but she learned fast. That was something Jack had come to admire most about her. She didn't talk much about the past anymore, but she didn't hide from it either. She just lived, every day, fully, as if survival was no longer the goal. Living was. Tommy had started walking, unsteady but determined. He'd stumble across the yard on fat little legs, chasing chickens and collapsing into the grass with soft laughter. Jack found himself watching him more often than not out of worry, but out of something he hadn't allowed himself in a long time. Hope. One morning, as they sat on the porch drinking coffee in the sun, Mara finally asked what had been circling both their minds for weeks. Do you ever think you'll leave this place? she said. Jack shook his head without looking at her. Used to think there was nothing left for me out here. Now I can't think of anywhere else I'd rather be. She smiled, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. Me neither. Then, after a pause, do you still talk to them? Eliza and Nathan? Jack nodded slowly. Every now and then, when it's quiet. Well, I'm not afraid to remember. They'd be proud of you. Jack's eyes stayed on the yard, where Tommy was stacking small rocks with serious concentration. I hope so. There was a peace in the cabin now. Not the kind that comes from silence, but from security. Nothing had come down the trail in weeks. The deputy marshal hadn't returned, and no more riders had appeared on the ridge. Jack didn't stop watching. He kept the rifle clean, the pistol loaded, the emergency path cleared. But the fear no longer drove them. It simply sat quietly on the shelf where it belonged. One evening, after the baby had gone to sleep, Mara stood in the doorway with her arms folded. She was wearing one of Jack's shirts, sleeves rolled up, him brushing her thighs. Her hair was loose. She looked relaxed, strong in a way that had nothing to do with defense. Jack looked up from his chair. She stepped forward slowly. I've been thinking, she said. I don't want to keep calling this your house. He raised an eyebrow. What do you want to call it? Ours. Jack set his coffee aside and stood. He didn't touch her, not yet. He just stood across from her, eye to eye. You sure about that? I've never been sure about anything. He stepped forward and kissed her. Not rushed, not unsure, just real. When they pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers. I don't have much to offer, he said. You gave me a second life, she answered. That's more than anyone ever did. They didn't need to say the words. But they did anyway, some nights later, just the two of them in front of the fire, hands clasped and voices low. There was no preacher, no paper, just truth, just choice. Weeks passed. The fields grew. The chickens laid more eggs. Tommy spoke his first word, Ma. Then, a week later, Jack pretended not to care, but he walked around with a grin that didn't leave for 2 straight days. One warm evening, Jack took Tommy out to the edge of the property, near the graves. He knelt there with him, quiet. The boy babbled to the wind while Jack stared at the headstones. Eliza, he murmured, I didn't think I'd come back to life. Not after you, but I did. And you were right. The world don't stop for grief, but it can give you one more chance. I took mine. He placed a fresh flower on her grave, then one on Nathan's, then stood. Tommy took his hand. They walked back to the cabin together. Inside, Mara stood at the doorway, a lantern in one hand. When she saw them return, her face lit up, not with relief, but with something stronger. Certainty. They were no longer surviving. They were living, together, and they weren't going anywhere.